One of the best things about meetings like this is the opportunity to associate with each other. And I don't really want to stop us from associating with each other, but I do want to move forward on our schedule this morning because I want everyone to have an opportunity to share that has prepared for today. And just a reminder that we do hope to do this sort of symposium around twice a year. And so the next one will be in roughly 6 months if we hold to that idea. And so I think that those of us who are on the International Evangelism Council would appreciate knowing of anyone who might want to share at the next one, whether that's in 6 months or a year. But if you are interested in sharing in this kind of format, please be sure to mention that to one of us. Dane Cedarstrom is sitting right up here, and if you can give him your contact information or give it to me or Gary, Holly, or anyone else that you are aware of on the or can anyone else that you are able to give that to so that we can remain in contact with you. Our next folks will be Aaron and April Smith, and I think that this morning we are literally in for some tremendous presentations for those of us who are interested in the gospel and interested in the missionary effort. It is our goal to give all the honor, glory, and credit to God, and it is an opportunity to be very impressed and to ponder the work of the Lord in His vineyard through His servants. So if you will come forward and appreciate your participation. Thank you.
It's good to be with you this morning. We would welcome all of the folks online too, and are thankful that they've joined or that they will watch at some point. My wife and I will share about our recent trip to Kenya specifically that we took over Christmas break basically, and us. We're both in education, and so we had that time, and that's the time frame it worked out for us. But to start this time, I'm going to ask my wife if she would share her testimony about why we even went to begin with, because this really, the genesis of this lands squarely with God and her having a conversation about this one day. So I want you to hear that first.
Well, when I met Aaron about, 9 years ago, one of the first things I started to learn about him was that he had traveled and done missionary work in Africa a few times. And so I suppose to some degree that was always in the back of my mind, kind of wondering once we were married and everything if I would be going too. But what happened that Aaron refers to is in May of 2020, when everything was shut down due to COVID, the All Saints Zoom restoration group started online, and it started in, March or April, but in May there was a service, and it was all of the participants, everyone sharing the ministry that day was in Kenya. And the very last part of that service, there was a family in their home sitting on their couch, and there was 4 of them, a mom and dad and 2 little boys, and they were going to share the hymn, the closing hymn for the service of the day. And when I was watching this service and I looked at that family on the couch, I don't know how to explain this to you except to say that I knew I was in that home. I could see around the home, I could see into the kitchen and the living room. They were sitting on the couch, but I could see more than I could see just what I should have been able to see just on the screen. And it was a very unique experience for me. And afterwards, I talked to God a lot about it, and I was praying about that experience and why was I allowed, how did that happen? Why was I allowed to see so much of their home? And the nudge or the question that God asked me was, what was the hymn that the family was singing? And the hymn that they sang was, I'll go where you want me to go. And so just by itself, that hymn or that title would lead you to believe that, okay, God, are you asking me to go to Africa? But I also knew Aaron's testimony when the very first time he was going to Africa, it all centered around that same exact hymn. So I knew it was related, that God was showing me, could I go to Africa and will I go where he wants me to go? But also it related to Aaron. So that was in May of 2020. And like I said, everything was shut down and we couldn't even go very many places in our own hometown, much less leave the country. And I questioned God, how can I go to Africa when everything is shut down right now? And I kind of kept questioning and kept praying, and nothing ever happened that year or even the next year. But last summer, Eric Odito was in town and actually stayed in our home. While he was there, he offered an invitation, and he said, April, will you come to Kenya? And I said, what would I do there? What would be my job? What would you want me to do? And he said, well, you could support your husband. So after he asked that question, I knew the door was opening, and we kind of talked about our timing. And like Aaron said, we're both in education, so it was summertime, and we thought, well, maybe we can go this summer while we have some time off from school, and it wasn't working. And so we finally looked at our next block of time off, and that was, Christmas and New Year time. So when we talked about that, they said, great, you'll come over for the older youth retreat, the first ever older youth retreat that they were having. And so then the wheels were set in motion, and that planning started to happen. And we booked the tickets, and that's what we're here to tell you about.
So one thing that came to my mind when we presented this earlier was, it seems that I, at least in my understanding of how we interpret mission work, especially as a culture, as American culture, we look at 4 different things. Our church really focuses on one, although we're delving or dabbling in 2, now 3. But those four items, generally when you think of mission work, and we think of it in relation to our church, as sharing the gospel, converting, having the Spirit work upon people, baptisms, that's very specific. Evangelism, reaching out to share the life-giving news. Another type of mission work, though, is pastoral. It's much more pastoral in nature. It's to help support those congregations that are in other lands, that we could help support that. And of course, over the years, we've done a lot of that with the priesthood retreats, especially in East Africa, that have now been taking place for like 15 years. The third one, which is most of when you talk to a normal Christian in America, you think of mission work, they all think of, well, I'm going to go and build somebody a house in a different country, right? It's more of the physical construction. It's more of the day-to-day, how can I go and physically help somebody improve their life, right? And then the last one, which you often hear about, again, more in the Christian world than in our world, is the medical missions. People going over to fix cleft palates, or to do dental work, or to just provide some basic surgeries that these people never would have access to, right? Well, in the short 30 minutes that we have, you're going to hear about all 4 of those types of mission work, right? Because that's the goal. That's what we're going to talk about. So, yes, thank you. So actually, before we even left, we had a small hiccup in the itinerary. This was right before Christmas, and if you remember, that's when the big storm hit here, and you guys were under 32 degrees for about 2 straight weeks and had lots of ice and snow, and for the first day, and that was the day our flight was supposed to leave. And so Southwest, who we were flying on initially, canceled our flight. And at least they gave me 24 hours notice. And so then we figured, okay, how can we do this? So we found a flight out of St. Louis that would get us to our connection down in Atlanta, but we had to leave that night. And so we literally sped up our process about 24 hours and had to leave about 24 hours earlier than we anticipated, which was not ideal, but thankfully we had some good saints who were able to take us. They drove us to St. Louis because we weren't going to fly back into St. Louis, and so they drove us there and then drove back home. So when we got there, we arrived, and we had taken some of these solar lights that Brian mentioned earlier, and you'll see them being dispersed at this older youth camp at the end of the retreat. But one of our concerns was getting them through customs. We had heard not so nice things about that process, and sure enough, they had marked one of our bags for checking in. Of course, we had multiple bags, and two or three, I think two of them had the solar lights in them. So they stopped us, and sure enough, they pulled us aside and said, what do you got here? These are electronic devices. And so we said, well, they're solar lights. We're giving them away. We don't sell them. And she goes, well, anything that comes into the country, we tax 100%. So we're like, okay, but we're not selling them. And she goes, it doesn't matter. We're going to tax you 100%. And then she took a couple of them and she walked away. Now, leading up to this whole time, we had been praying about this experience and praying that this wouldn't be an issue. Well, she walked back like 5 minutes later, and she came and she goes, "When we tax everything at 100% when you come into our country. So if it's worth $10, you got to pay $10 on it, right?" I mean, it was crazy. And she looks at me and she goes, "But solar, we don't tax anything that's solar that comes into the country. We encourage that. We want to encourage that." So she handed them back to us. I threw them in the bag. I zipped up the bag, and we left as fast as we can. And the lady who had stopped us originally came over, and she was talking. She had called this lady out. She was like, she pointed to us like, "Why are you letting them go? What's going on?" And we were out of there. We didn't want to stick around to have that conversation anymore. So we got out. We didn't end up having to pay a single dime on any of that to get through the airport. So even though it's not quite like Brother Andrew smuggling Bibles into Germany or Poland back in his day, we felt blessed and felt like the Lord helped that situation. Just if you've never been there, the Great Rift Valley is it's quite a sight to behold. And as you travel from Kenya down to Kisumu, you'll be able from Nairobi down to Kisumu, which is the path that we took. Here's some of your wildlife right on the side of the road there for us. Some baboons who gather because people continually feed them from their car. An ancient volcano that's been defunct. So Doug Smith, obviously most of you know or have heard of Doug. Doug and his wife, and with the help and support of saints here and all over actually, have started a medical clinic in near Kisumu. It's in a town called Owasi, I believe. And so Doug was able to pick us up and to take us. And so this was actually now Christmas Day. So we spent Christmas Eve, actually, this was Christmas Eve. We spent Christmas Eve with Doug at his I'm going to call it a duplex because that's what we would call it in this country. But it's his home, just has two sides. And so there is the home that Doug has, and you can see the rain collection system, and that is something that we'll talk about here in just a little bit. So, and there's just pictures of the inside. It's very much nicer than almost any of the hotels that I've ever stayed at or YMCAs that I've ever stayed at over there, right? So it's been a tremendous blessing to those who've gone as far as going over to do mission work. They have someplace safe to stay and someplace that's very nice, actually. So from Doug's house, though, you can turn left and you can head to the clinic, or you can turn right and head to the school. And I say the school in context of they have a higher education institution now. It's to teach skilled trades to anyone who wants to come and pay, really. But they focus on their own kids, obviously. But anybody could come and go there. So the retreat that we had was all at the school, even though the medical clinic backs right up the properties side by side. Yep.
I just wanted to share about this picture because this was our first time stepping into the church. This was the school, and then you're looking at the great hall of the school, and that's where all of the services are held. And on Christmas Day, there was a joint service between the two branches of Kisumu and Owasi, and so that was my first time to go to the school and to be in this hall. And when we got there, we had been traveling for 2 or 3 days, and we hadn't been feeling well the day before, and it was Christmas morning, and we came over to this building, and they were playing the hymns. Were playing when we got there, and the Spirit just met me, and I felt like I was at home. It just felt like I was anywhere I'd ever been to worship, and it didn't feel strange or unusual. It just felt very much like home. And so when I see this picture, that was just my first step walking in the door, and that's what that reminds me of.
So Elder Eric greeted everyone there. Elder Doug actually taught one of the classes that was there that morning. We didn't really have a formal worship, but in some ways it was semi-formal, I guess I'll put it that way. More of a class setting. We did have some non-members who were there, so that was nice. They got to hear Doug and hear him talk. And then there was also another lady who was there, and another Mzungu, and from Missouri, actually, and she had, her family has obviously been really connected with that work over there. We did not know she was going to be there at the same time, so it was very interesting for us to meet while we were over there. So they invited us to come up and share each one and introduce ourselves. So that's Elder Tom Akeo. Tom is Eric's best classmate from college, during college time, and I met Tom 20 years ago on my first trip in 2003. And then, of course, and he is the head of the school. He's the schoolmaster there at the higher institution. Atin Zion is the name. And then, of course, Pamela, which you know is Eric's wife. And then their second son, Pressler, who is studying to be a doctor, and he also then works and helps at the clinic that Doug has started. Oops. And so there is Dean, who is the master chef, who's been trained in culinary. He actually teaches some of the culinary classes there, or all of them, at the school. And he was cooking lamb, I think, that day. Goat, sorry, not lamb. That was kind of a delicacy for that, and we had quite a few people that were there. It was quite a setup. So here's just some pictures of the school. Again, that's the Great Hall. You'll see maybe another picture of this a little bit later. That's the kitchen, which is right beside the Great Hall. Now this is Mzungu. You're looking at two, but they nicknamed Alice Mzungu because when she was born, she was very fair-skinned. What you don't know yet is that when I met her and I figured out who she was, what you're looking at is the miracle girl. This young lady, when I was over there on my third trip in 2006, I believe, or 5, we had walked in, Steve Ferguson and I had walked in along with Ellie Akecho, and this is Ellie's daughter. And we had walked into their home, and this little girl had, for all intents and purposes, been dead. And literally so, to where the mother and Tom Nawiri, who was there at the time, they were mourning because she had no life in her. She wasn't breathing. They couldn't sense any movement out of her at all. And the mother had tried to take her to the hospital. The hospital sent her home and said, there's nothing we can do. And she had, for all intents and purposes, was not living anymore. And Tom, because the daughter had, there was no sign of life in her, Tom asked for his oil, and he anointed her, and he said, as he described this later to Ellie, Steve, and I, he said, I had many words come to my mind to pray. He said, but the only words that I could get out of my mouth were, "Oh God, help us. Oh God, help us." And it was just a short while later, as she was laying on the, she was only 2, maybe 3, she was laying on the coffee table in front of their couch. And life came back into her. That's all I can say. Her eyes rolled back. Her eyes had rolled back into the back of her head. They rolled back forward. She gasped for breath, and she sat up, and she came back. And God brought this little girl back from death. And so to meet her in person, because I had not seen her since that trip, was a great joy. It was a great joy to me, not only to meet her as a young adult now, in which I found that to be true over many of these young adults that we had the opportunity. Many of them were in between the ages of 0 and 5 when I was there previously. And so to see that they were still active and now faithful, and their parents had done a good job over these 15 years, 20 years of raising them and bringing them up in the gospel, and that they were active and faithful in the gospel, that brought my heart great, great joy over the course of this 7 or 8 days that we were there. They played games that afternoon as two congregations. Some of the kids had arranged these games. You can see the one on the left is it was a sack race, and the two guys there on the front, they took a great tumble. But both congregations that met together, it was a great time of fellowship for them. They celebrate Christmas a little differently than we do here, right? Can you imagine asking your congregation, sorry, give up all your family time and come and worship with another congregation and have fellowship time all day? And it was all day. And it started around 9 or 10 and didn't get done until 4 or 5, right? Quite an experience and quite a great way to celebrate that. So just some more of the activities and games. And at the end, they had some little gold coins that were really little chocolates, and so all the kids each clamored to get their little chocolates that they could get for that day. And Doug, of course, playing his guitar. You don't go over there without having Doug play his guitar, and it was fantastic. So then we're going to talk just a little bit about the medical mission that is currently there. Doug's named after Doug's mother. Very instrumental in trying to bring good health to the saints. And so this is the front of it. It's an old house. It's an old provincial house that they have converted into a medical clinic. They have really one main exam room. They have another room that's the office. They have another room that's the lab. But really they need a bigger space. And they've got the land there to do that. So that's definitely one thing that's in consideration, is if funding could be raised, they could actually make an actual medical clinic, but instead of using this house that they have, which for now serves the purpose just adequately. This is some of the pictures and some of the courses that are offered there at the school. One of the great things that I know that Eric has told me from years ago now was that when we started their higher education institution fund to help kids once they got out of high school, we were adequately providing means. They pay $200 to $400 a year to go to high school. That's like a year's salary for most people over there, so they don't have that. And so there was a lot of people who were funding the kids to go in high school. If they don't go in high school, there's 50 to 70% unemployment. They're in drugs, they're in prostitution, they're in all these other things like you expect. There's no hope. And so to keep them in high school is huge. But then after that, really to even have a chance at getting a job, you really need to go on and have some kind of training, some kind of skill, some kind of formal education. So we started the Higher Education Fund 15 years ago, roughly, 20 years ago. And Eric has told me that one specific financial piece has been a tremendous success over the last 20 years. And he says that because now in 20 years we have seen the fruit of that, to where these people who have gone through those programs now have very well-paying jobs. They're able to now support their own children going to school, so they're not asking us for money to do that. The kids we're sending now to school are coming from abject poverty. They're orphans, or they just have a mother at home, and there's nothing they have no source of income. So most of these other people who've gone through those programs have well-paying jobs, good-paying jobs for over there, and they're able to support that. In fact, they became so prosperous in some ways that they were actually funding their own retreats, right? Because they were able to support themselves. And that's a tremendous success over the course of the 15 to 20 years. And so this college is really just an extension. And if you think about the progression in the church here, right? What did we see as we grew up, so to speak, from the 1860s to the early 1900s and then on? We started a college, right? We started a medical mission, basically, in independence. So these were natural progressions that the church made in our history. It's naturally progressing that way for them as well. Yeah, just a couple more pictures of the school, and then just inside, that's their culinary space. You can see it's not elaborate, but it's where they teach. So the other picture from another angle, that's the auto shop. By the way, that car on the right is the one that Judy was in when she was basically almost killed. in her wreck that they had. And to see that car and to see that she's a walking miracle, just like Alice is, it's amazing. Lots of property there, big chunk of land that they have. It's very nice. Those are some of the dorms, I think. Inside of the dorms, they rent the mattresses as needed. So again, that's some of the classrooms. That's looking down the long hall. You will see that there is no gutter on the long hall. And that's one of the things I noticed. We were there. I had never been there in a rainy season. We were right at the end of the rainy season. And one night I was outside and all this water was just running off the roof. And it was a brand new roof that the Green Valley COC had bought for them and put on, thankfully. So they didn't have holes. It wasn't leaking anymore inside the building. And I looked at all that water and I thought, oh, over here, water's life, right? You know, water is life. And so to not capture all of that rainwater was distressing to me. And so we came back home, and those are the type of things that you can help with, right? And so we raised $1,500 to $1,700 really quick, and we were able to send it back over, and they can put a super long gutter that'll go both, and they'll have those two large black plastic containers on each end, and we'll be able to store thousands of gallons of water now that they weren't able to store before. Okay. That's their computer lab inside the college. So this was us planning for the retreat. You heard Brian mention it. You generally don't plan too much, and if you do plan, your plans are going to change. And so we planned, and then our plans changed. Kisumu is it's a provincial town like most provincial towns in third world countries. You get a flavor for what that's like there. We weren't in really Nairobi just other than a couple of hours at a time, and so we didn't get too many pictures of that. But one of the ladies you can barely see, she's carrying a complete chest of something on her head. That's the furniture store, right? Just all out there. So then we started the retreat, and the retreat was scheduled to go, I think, for 2.5 days, and we ended up going 3 or 3.5. We expected 60 to 80. Eric told us expect 60 to 80, and so we brought some materials, and we were making copies, and more people showed up, and more people showed up, and more people showed up. By the end of it all, we had 91 that had registered. This is the first time they had ever done an older youth retreat there. So, and again, schedules are not, and it's not that they don't want to keep a schedule, but when you don't have reliable transportation or reliable communication, you can't keep a schedule like we do over here. We're very snobbish in our scheduling, right? I mean, we're very, you were here at 7:15, and if you're not here at 7:15, even in college classes, right, by 7, depending on the authority of the professor, you're out of there in 5 or 10 minutes if he's not there, right? So over there, totally different. It's like most of the second and third world countries that you would experience. So even though we had a schedule, it varied, and we flexed it multiple times throughout most of the days that we were there. They loved to sing, and we loved to hear them sing, and of course there's Doug. And some of these pictures you'll see, they start to grow in numbers because each day we would get more who came. We ended up, there's the picture of the rainwater just falling off the edge, and that's when I took that and said, there's got to be something we can do about this, right? So some of the classes, some of the young ladies that were there, they were very good about holding to the definition of what makes an older youth. My son has been over there for their, I'm going to call it youth retreats or youth camps. And anybody who wants to show up shows up, right? And so it doesn't matter if you're in high school or not, if you're an elementary kid or if you're a college kid or if you're an adult, you just show up, right? They were very good. We did not have any high school students who were there. They all had graduated, and they were all unmarried. That was their qualifications, their 2 qualifications. So we did have some who were older, probably in their 30s, but really everybody was in that young age. And it was beautiful. In so many ways, it was beautiful. They had never had this retreat before. And so for them to be able to get together and to meet each other from all over, there was only 2 from different countries, 2 from Tanzania who were able to join us, but all the rest were from Kenya only, not Uganda or Rwanda, even though the church is growing there. It just takes so much money to travel and get through the country, $50 a piece, and like I said, when your average income is $200 to $400 a year, $50, you can't do that. So all from Kenya who had gotten there, and it was just beautiful for them to see the strength in numbers, because when they went back to their hometown, they were one of 2 from their hometown who believed in this gospel, right? But when they came to that organization, when they came to that time, they were able to see, there's a whole lot of us, and there's a whole lot of them that are just my age, right? And of course then, I hate to say it, but it's not that we were trying to provide a dating service, because that was not the theme at all, but those things naturally happen in those environments, right? You start to notice somebody else, they're from so-and-so town, and then you have church families become established because of those types of things and those interactions that they have in settings like this. So that was all very, very positive. I'll talk about the bread.
I love this picture. I took it because it was breakfast one morning, and what they did was they put out loaves of bread and bowls or plates, and the kids got 3 slices of bread for their breakfast and a cup of the chai, it was kind of like hot chocolate, and that was breakfast. And I thought, what would it be like here in the United States if we had a youth camp and put out loaves of bread for their breakfast? And I think that our kids would be saying, is there jelly? Is there going to be something to go with this? Are we having eggs? Asking for what else goes with it. And they were very thankful and content to have their bread. And that picture to me was just representative of the attitude I experienced all throughout our trip, was just the thankfulness and gratefulness for what they had, and not wishing they had something different or more. It was just, I'm being fed.
So one of the nice things about this, because they were all young and because they were all from Kenya, they all spoke English, almost every single one. We did not have to have any translation whatsoever, and so we were able to cover a lot of content in these classes, which is what Eric asked for when we came. And so between Doug and I, we did break them between female and male, and so you'll see some of that. There's the class that the ladies met in, and so I would teach there, Doug would teach in the main hall for the young men, and then he and I would flip, and the kids would stay in the same place. So we taught the same class twice, but just to the different groups that were there. And we probably had 8 or 10 different classes that we taught throughout the whole 2 or 3 days. Again, very well received. Many of them, there were non-members who were present, and so for them to hear the story of the restoration, the falling away, the church that Christ established, the Book of Mormon, those type of things, those were all new for many of those young people. And of course, many of them had just newly been baptized, which you'll get to see some of those. So there's a picture, you're familiar with, I'm sure, that slide. It's Jesus. And Doug, as he always does, right, he's got a great way of connecting with the kids, and so he engaged them in the first day of really bringing them together to get to know each other, because again, they were coming from all different parts of the country, had never met each other. So basic stuff that you would do at a youth camp, mixers, those type of things. So that's what that represents. And they were doing some of those mixers that day, and they would have a sheet, and the sheet would drop, and whoever could say the other person's name first, then they had to come to the other team. It was a fun game. The kids loved it. It was a riot. It really was a lot of fun. So there's our schedule officially, right? If you were to zoom in on that, you would see that we had very firm times for everything that did or did not actually, land that way every day. But we did create the schedule. Again, you can start to see that the building's getting a little more full. And there's Eric. He was really talking, he was talking after class. I was going to say he taught a class on stewardship, but that's not the stewardship slide. That's the story about the restoration. So, and this is Leonard, Elder Leonard. Leonard is very special to me because on my first trip, I knew I was going to meet people I never knew. I knew I was going to be asked to participate in ordinances, and I would have no clue who this person was. It's not like here in the States when somebody asks you to baptize them or ordain them or do something. I mean, you have this personal connection, right? And you can prepare that way. Over there, I knew that was going to be none of that. And so when we got there on our first day back in 2003, and our first day was it was Sunday, and we had a worship service with a wedding and 5 baptisms and 4 ordinations, and the list just went on and on. One of my prayers before I left was that the Spirit would witness in those ordinances to me. And I'm not saying that exactly the way I worded my prayer. I don't remember that with going back to look at my journal. But they had 4 ordinations, and Leonard was going to be ordained a priest that day. And the other 3 men, Eric called up, and he asked them who they wanted to ordain them, and so they chose 2 men. He got to Leonard, and he said, Leonard, he says, Elder Aaron and Elder so-and-so is going to come over and ordain you. He didn't give Leonard a choice. And that kind of caught me off guard, and all I can do is, as I laid my hands on his head, I was ordaining him to the office of priest, and the Lord, he allowed me to see and to know that Leonard was going to be an elder. And I had to ordain him to the office of priest. So I did. So we did. We ordained him to the office of priest. Well, of course, in the course of time over the last 20 years, he was ordained an elder later on, several years later. And Leonard then had some tremendous struggles. Actually, Leonard was captured by some men who actually had been killing people, and they held him hostage, and they beat him severely, and they left him for dead. And by the grace of God, he lived, and he has now come back just in this recent time frame, and he's now back active again with the church, because that did a lot of damage to Leonard in his mind and his emotions. And so I was so thrilled to see Brother Leonard there, and also to meet his children, his 2 kids who I had known from, again, when they were just little. Sorry, I didn't plug in, and so if this goes dead, it's going to go dead. We'll plug it in. So again, some of the classes that we taught there, some of the men who shared, one of the young men is studying to be a doctor again. This is not Pressler. This is another young man over there, and he has an amazing testimony and had a great experience at the retreat, especially with dealing with forgiveness and forgiving some people in his life who had done him horrible wrong. There was tremendous testimonies at the closing service about some of those things. We had a young man who was there who struggled with addiction, specifically alcohol, and for the 4 days that he was with us, he says, I never once had a desire to take a drink of anything. And so it was, again, a testimony that the quality of the spirit that was there. Doug teaching one of the classes, some of the young ladies again. That's actually Tom Macayo's daughter there in the center, Red. Her name is Ruby, and Ruby is a fantastic young lady. Can't wait to have her in Zion. Quite a few more of these. I think I'm going the right direction. I'm going to zip through a lot of that. And that's Michael or Michelle. Most of you have heard or seen of him because he does the soapstone. And so he'll put that out on Garland's list, and he's very creative and very good at what he does there, but he's also one of the elders there in Kenya. They had a talent night. Again, very exciting to see what they came up with. Most of them sang, with the exception of this group, the group from Tanzania, and they did a kind of like a trivia game, and they gave them numbers, and then they asked them church history questions. So the answer is 1805. The guys got it right. Can you tell me what the question would have been? When was Joseph Smith born? That was the question they asked, and then the people had to arrange the numbers in the right order. So they asked 5 or 6 questions like that. It was a very creative thing that they did, and it tied in church history. It was really kind of cool. That was one of the non-members that was there, Peter. He's quite a handful. You can tell by his appearance, right? Just the red hat, and yeah, he was a go-getter. And there's Leonard leading our last day. I think it was Friday morning devotions. And then here's some of the pictures from our last, I guess that was the day before. Okay. April had another testimony. So this is the group. Brian talked about the group from Mombasa. All these college kids, right? And they're excited about the gospel. And so 13 of them were able to make the trip and were there at the retreat. And what was so fascinating for me, and I don't know if the picture's in there or not, but I was able to meet one of them who had literally just been confirmed by my father, who had just been over there the month before. And so he knew my dad because of that. And so that was kind of exciting for us to make that connection. But these 13 young men who were there were very excited to be there. and we were thrilled to get to meet them and to visit and share with them. And as you've heard, that work is growing significantly now. There's Leonard and his 2 kids. And then, of course, you can tell the whole room's full now, right? By the end, we had 91. And so it was thrilling to see that building just continue to fill and fill and fill for those 4 days. And it was just an exciting and a great time to be there and to share. We had a closing service on, I think it was Friday night. One of the unique things about this location is that right beside their property is another church property. This church, I was expecting on Sunday, but because it was a holiday week, they were having services also on that Friday. Well, their services over there are very loud. They've got the large speaker system. They really boom the music. They do all sorts of things. And so we have all the windows open. There's no AC, of course. And so the doors and the windows are all open. And all we can hear in our very calm service is all of this loud music blaring right through the windows. Shouting, and all the shouting that they did. And at one point I knew that as people would come up and pray or testify and offer their dedication, I was moving towards the doors to close the doors, right? And I knew that at some point I'm going to just have to close the doors, right? And this one person was going on and he was sharing, and I committed to myself that after he's done, I'm going to go do this. But at the same time, April's praying, Lord, you got to shut this music off, right? This is a total distraction to the service and what's going on here. And lo and behold, one of the young men just stands up right in the middle of this other guy's table. He just walks over and he just shuts the doors. And as soon as he did that, there was this peace that just came over that group. It was just so beautiful. We talked with Doug later about that night as we debriefed with him every day. And Doug shared, well, isn't that appropriate? Because that young man, Rashid, is a teacher in the church. And what's a teacher's job is to keep evil out of the church, right? And so literally he was fulfilling his duty as a priesthood member that day by his action. And the Lord really allowed him to magnify his calling on behalf of everyone who was there. It was a beautiful understanding, when we came to that point. And in fact, that's the young man who was sharing at the time when we've got to change this situation. Fred, his name was Fred. At the end, some of the ladies, and I don't know who, I don't know if we've ever found out who, some women here from the United States had made some paintings, and so we took those over and we gave them to the cooks. Eric wanted the cooks to have them as kind of a memento, and so we were able to share those with the cooks and they could have them to hang in their homes. The cooks were fantastic. I try to feed 100 people on an open fire 3 times a day, and hauling the water from 50 to 75 yards away, which now with the new rainwater project, it'll be like 10 feet away, so it'll be really good. But still, they did an amazing job. And there is passing out those solar lights. They had enough that they were able to give every single one of those kids who wanted one, so that when the electricity goes off, which is very spotty, they're able to still read or study because of those lights that they will have, the lanterns that they'll have. That's Rashid. Rashid is a fantastic young man. I'm excited for him and the work that the Lord has for him to do in the future. And there's all 91 of us plus some of the Mzungus. So I think there was 94 plus then we didn't count the other elders and ministry from Kenya. Over 100. It was really great. Hillary was a fantastic young man. Loved to meet him. And we could go on and on about these. That's Faith Makawiti. She is from Tanzania, one of the two. And then there is, Gary, can you tell me who that is? That's the Anditi family. Walter Anditi, right? And so we were able to meet in their home. And so to kind of bring this full circle, this is the home that April saw in her experience. I call it a vision, because she saw things that she wasn't able to see on the TV, right? And what was so amazing about this was before we left, we knew we wanted to be administered to. Well, we were going to do that, but then our flights got bumped up a whole day, right? And so I reached out to John Eichhorn, who's my neighbor, and I said, John, can you come over and grab somebody and administer to us? Well, lo and behold, who did he call? He called nobody else but Gary Hawley. And now Gary lives in Independence. He doesn't live out in our neck of the woods. And so it was a complete surprise to us that he got Gary to come with him. And who do we meet here in Walter Anditi's house other than Gary Hawley? Because they named their son after Gary Hawley. Right? So it's kind of the whole full circle there. And it was just, the Lord had his fingerprints on all of that and allowed us to see, just his work and that he wanted this to happen. he was blessing the entire trip. There's other experiences and testimonies about just the safety and the protection that we had. Whenever you travel on the roads over there, you have to have the protection, or else things don't go well. So it was just a tremendous blessing. Of course, then at the end, we were able to just say goodbye to Pam and to Eric, and spend just a brief amount of time near Lake Victoria just to see it. But the reason I wanted to leave that picture in there is that Lake Victoria is so central to the saints' lives because they all live around the lake up in that area. And the lake provides food, the lake provides jobs, and that's a better one. And of course it's massive. It's like one of our Great Lakes. It's the second largest lake in the world, right? And Lake Superior is bigger, but that's it. So Lake Victoria is amazing, but it really does help us understand and see how vital water is to their life. And so, again, we think of water because we've got all this clean running water all the time, and they just don't have any of that. So again, Jesus said, "What? I am the living water." And so when we go and take the gospel to these people, we're providing them spiritual living water, right? But at the same time, when you see your brother in need, it's really hard. But you know that, as Brian said, you don't go to make a rice Christian. And that's why our church really has never focused on the building projects or the other projects, right? The projects that you saw and that I talked about, the school and the rainwater collection and the other things, those have been a natural outgrowth of the growth of the church over there over 30 years, 1994 when the first missionaries went. So 30 years it's been growing. That's not how we started. That we would never try to go and start that, because then they look at it, okay, what can I get from you? And because you're white, they look at you and they say, "You're rich, you're my way out of here." And they will do anything. They will say whatever lie they've got to tell you to get out of their situation, to get you to believe in them, basically, to give them a way out. And I'm not going to blame them for that, right? Their culture is so different than ours. So you have to be discerning, and you have to know that the utmost thing that they need is Jesus. And sharing the gospel with them is so fantastic. And you see the fruit in the lives of people who have suffered. And I will share one quick testimony. As we left Kisumu, they told us they would see us soon, and so that April and I took that we would be going back, right? Because if they're going to see us soon, we have to go back. So that was our invitation to come back, was the sign there in the Kisumu airport. One of the groups that had just been started was on one of the fingers of Lake Victoria. And the man had an experience, a dream or a vision in which he saw something, and he went to his local elders, and they said, "Well, this means a new church is coming, and you need to embrace it." And so literally like the next week, Eric shows up, and he starts talking, and he accepts that, and he believes that this is the new church. Everybody thought this is fantastic up until then that church begins to grow, right? And he begins to share with others, and others from other churches start to join this church, right? Then they didn't like that so much, and so they have persecuted that particular little small group significantly. They were losing their source of income as the other churches, right? Because you're taking away our people. And so they face things that we generally don't face over here in some ways. And one of the great testimonies from Brother Mike Ballantyne and his patriarchal blessings that he had the chance to go over there and offer was a young lady who was near this specific place, and how in her patriarchal blessing, and Mike would tell you, he says, "I don't know if I've ever done this in a blessing," he says, "but the Lord prophesied over her and told her that she would face significant trials, but if she would keep a hold of the Lord's hand, that he would see her through those trials." Well, she had just been baptized, recently. She received that blessing, and it wasn't weeks, maybe a month later, that the people in her local community turned completely against her. They called her a witch. They would throw rocks at her and spit on her as she would walk around the town. They did everything they could. She lost her home. They tried to destroy her. And she said, if it wasn't for that blessing, that the Lord had already warned me that this was going to happen, I would have never stayed with it. I would have given up. She says, but I knew that the Lord was with me, and he would walk with me through this. And it's now been over a year or two later, and they have now embraced her. I say embraced in a loose way, but they don't cast stones at her anymore. They don't mock her. That she's accepted back as part of the community. She now has a place to live again, and the Lord has returned unto her the blessing of the physical things that had been taken away from her. But it was a tremendous testimony of God's grace in her life and the work that he continues to do in East Africa. Any questions about the youth retreat? Again, I know that in the past they've been having retreats. They try to have at least one every year for the youth, the high school, middle school age students. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but I know my son Andrew has been over there for at least one or two of those. So again, it's kind of fun because I got to see people who knew my son and who knew my father, and then they got to meet me. So they got to make the three-generation connection there, which was just really, it was very unique when they found out that Andrew was my son and Lyle was my father. But because I haven't been in 15 years, right? So they none of them hardly know me anymore. But no questions. We will stop and take a break. Brother Bill.
Were the youth able to provide their own transportation money to get to the camp, or did you have to supply money for them to come?
Yeah. So half and half, and I use the term half and half somewhat loosely. I mean, there were some who their parents they were employed and they were able to fund their own way to come. We did provide funding for that travel because of the bus tickets and the other things. Some of them were like Mombasa to there was like, I don't know, a 13-hour bus ride or something, and it wasn't cheap. So, yeah, we did fund quite a few of their ability to come there. In fact, we had, April actually had a coworker before we left, and she walked up to her and she goes, I know where you're going. And she goes, and she gave her some money, and she said, I want you to use this to help a kid who maybe couldn't get there to get there. And so when we got there, we turned over the money for the food, and we were providing the money for the food for the retreat, and then some of the transportation. And lo and behold, at the end, because more people had come and there was more food and we stayed longer, it ended up being that there was $300 that was needed to cover the excess. And we had $300 left in our wallet, right? And so the Lord he worked it all out. I mean, it was perfect. But yes, the short answer is yes, we did, but not for everybody. It wasn't a universal expectation that way. Gary.
This might be for April, if that's okay. April, when my wife was over there, she'd been there one time now, like you. She comes back with a perspective of ministry for the Lord from a female's point of reference. And I cannot get her off of that. And finally I found I'm not supposed to. What did you, right now, and it'll process, I'm sure, for weeks and weeks, but what can you share with us now after you've been there and have seen the eyes and heard the voice of other young women there? What do you discern that women need there? Is it all that different than what women need here? Or what's your perspective on women's ministry there?
Well, one of my favorite things or favorite parts of the trip was, Aaron kind of mentioned it, but to me it was like the focal point or the big thing about the trip was that the young people came from all parts of the country and they came together during that week. And the theme of the retreat, I don't think we ever mentioned it, it was, ye are the body of Christ. And as they came together, you could feel the strength of the body being together. And then we noticed as they were ready to leave, they were strengthened to go back to their homes and to their schools and to their workplaces. And so I think that was my biggest understanding of the young people or whatever, was that they are so few when they're out in where they live, in their homes and their workplaces and schools. But they came together and were strengthened, and I think that gave them a sense of wanting more to be with them. So they were ready to go share, and they want their daily lives to be more like that retreat was, so they want more people to be with them in that body. And another thing particularly about the women, our last day of our trip, when we went into a home, the mom told us how weary she was and how spiritually down she felt. And she'd been going to church. She'd been, doing a lot of the things. And we talked to Eric about it afterwards. I'm kind of leaving out a lot of things she said, but just overall, she had this spiritual weariness. And Eric talked about the need for supporting the women, So I don't know that I have good answers or what we need, but I know, the women's retreats, they had the one in the fall, and what I learned was that some of the women just aren't able to go and do that. So I'm sure there's a sense, or they're gaining more understanding of they need to find ways to particularly minister to the women. I'm glad you asked me that question to keep thinking and praying about it. I don't know if I ever shared anything that, I don't know. The young people for me was what, they seemed so strengthened by being there together. So I hoped that they would carry that. And like we said, that was the first older youth retreat, but I think they realized how wonderful it was that there's a need to continue doing the older youth retreat, like targeting for that age of people over there.
So I'm not going to answer that question, but before I forget, I do want to bear witness and testimony that what Brian shared is the key. And I even leaned over to my wife as he was sharing specifically about the message that was given at the Kirtland Temple, and that was, or the House of the Lord, and that was very specific in that he said, what's going to happen in 2 years? And he says, we're not prepared for the spiritual things that are going to happen in 2 years. And I knew he was going that way, and it was just like the Lord allowed me to confirm that ahead of what he said, and that's the right way to look at that message now. And just like he said, we've often focused on the negative, but it's the spiritual power that's going to come on the earth. It's the spiritual blessing, and are we prepared for that as a people? And we have to answer like the elders did over there. I can't prepare for you. I can only prepare for myself and try to prepare my family for that. But we have to be about getting prepared for that blessing that the Lord wants to pour out upon his people.
Thank you so much, Aaron and April. Why don't we take a little break, and then we'll start again. And I appreciate everyone here. Thank you so much.